The winter of 1887 did not arrive in Dakota Territory the way seasons are supposed to arrive, gradually, apologetically, giving the land and its people time to adjust. It came the way a verdict comes, sudden, final, without room for appeal. October had been a liar. The days had stretched long and golden across the plains, the sky a deep, unhurried blue that made a person believe against all experience that the world was a generous place. The grass still held some color. The mornings were cold but honest. People let themselves hope that this year perhaps the winter would be mild. Perhaps this year the plains would show some mercy. They were wrong. By the last week of October, the temperature dropped 15 degrees in a single afternoon. The wind shifted to the north and brought with it a smell that every experienced homesteader on the Dakota plains recognized immediately. The metallic iron-cold scent of deep winter of a season that had not come to visit, but to stay. The old-timers looked at the sky and said nothing. They had learned that the sky in Dakota did not respond to argument. It only responded to preparation. And so they went home, checked their wood piles, checked their chinking, checked their stores of salted meat and dried corn, and they braced themselves. For Elsa Voss, there was nothing to brace. She stood at the single window of the cabin, watching the sky change color, and she understood with a clarity that felt almost peaceful that she was in serious trouble. The woodpile beside the cabin was a joke. It would last 2 weeks of real cold, maybe 3 if she was careful. If she burned small fires, if she wore every piece of clothing she owned to bed. The cabin itself was a problem she had not let herself fully examine until now. Jakob had built it in a hurry in the first summer of their marriage with the intention of expanding it before the next winter came. He had planned so many things before the next winter came. The logs were thin by Dakota standards. The chinking the mud and straw mixture packed between the logs to seal out the wind had dried and cracked in the heat of summer and had not been replaced. She could feel the air moving through the walls on still days. On windy days, the cabin breathed cold like a living thing. Jakob had been dead for 6 months. He had been 31 years old, broad-shouldered, steady-handed. A man who could look at a piece of unbroken land and see a farm the way other men could look at a blank page and see a story. He had loved this quarter section of Dakota prairie with the particular passion of someone who had grown up with nothing and now had something, however hard and unyielding that something might be. He had died of a fever in 4 days. The fever had come on a Tuesday, and by Saturday he was gone. And the land, the debt, the half-finished barn, the cracking cabin, and the enormous silence of the plains were all left to Elsa. She was 19 years old. She had come west from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where her mother kept a tidy house on a narrow street, and her father worked in a dry goods store where the winters were cold, but manageable, where neighbors were close enough to hear you if you called out. She had come west because Jakob had asked her to, and because she had loved him with the kind of love that makes geography irrelevant. She had learned the plains slowly, painfully, the way you learn a language spoken by people who do not particularly want you to understand it. She had learned the wind and the silence and the way distances swallowed sound. She had learned that on the Dakota prairie, self-sufficiency was not a virtue, it was a requirement as basic and non-negotiable as breathing. What she had not learned, what she had relied on Jacob to know, was how to survive a Dakota winter alone. The women in the surrounding homesteads looked at her with the specific kind of pity that is almost worse than contempt. A soft, sorrowful pity that had already decided her fate and was simply waiting for the outcome to confirm it. They brought her bread and pickled vegetables and left them on the doorstep without knocking, the way you leave food for an animal you cannot quite bring yourself to watch starve. They meant well. Elsa knew they meant well. But their kindness had the texture of a farewell, and she found it harder to accept than she expected. The men looked past her, not unkindly, but with a practical efficiency that was perhaps more honest than the women's pity. They looked at her land and saw a quarter section that would be available come spring. They looked at her cabin and saw a structure that would not make it through February. They looked at her woodpile and said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. It was into this landscape of quiet desperation that Cornelius Hatch arrived on the 23rd of October, riding a good horse and wearing a coat that cost more than Elsa's entire household. He was 55 years old, heavy-set, but not soft, with a broad face that had been weathered by years of Dakota wind into something that resembled authority. He was the land agent for the Northern Pacific Railroad, a position that gave him the kind of power on the plains that in other places would require an official title and a government seal. In Dakota Territory in 1887, controlling the land meant controlling everything, and Cornelius Hatch controlled a great deal of land. He was also in his own way a builder. Not with his hands he employed men for that, but in philosophy. He had designed or supervised the construction of nearly every substantial homestead in the county. And his design philosophy was simple, consistent, and in the way that all philosophies built on genuine experience tend to be partially correct. Build thick walls. Use the best logs you can find. Install a cast iron stove, a Monarch if you could afford it, and feed it constantly through the winter. Fight the cold with mass and fire. The cold was an enemy, and you dealt with enemies by overwhelming them. His own house was the largest in the region, a fortress of heavy timber and fieldstone that consumed a small forest each winter and maintained through sheer ferocity of combustion, a temperature that made it possible to live without thinking constantly about dying. It was, by any measure, an impressive achievement. Cornelius Hatch was proud of it. He had earned the right to be proud of it. He dismounted at Elsa's gate. There was no actual gate, just a gap in the fence line where a gate would eventually go, and walked to the cabin door with the unhurried confidence of a man who already knew the outcome of the conversation he was about to have. He knocked. 2 solid knocks, not unkind. Elsa opened the door. She had been expecting someone. She had seen the horse from the window. She had not expected Hatch. She had met him only once, briefly, when Jacob was still alive. But she recognized him. And she recognized with a clarity that surprised her exactly why he had come. "Mrs. Voss," he said. His voice was not unkind either. This was what she had not prepared for, that he would be reasonable, even gentle in the way that men are gentle when they know they hold all the advantages and do not need to be anything else. "I hope I'm not calling it a bad time." "You're not," she said, and stepped back from the door to let him in. He came inside, filling the small room with his presence, the way a large piece of furniture fills a room. Suddenly there is less space, and the space that remains rearranges itself around the new arrival. He looked around the cabin with the practiced eye of a man who assessed structures the way other men assessed weather, automatically, continuously, without having to think about it. What he saw did not please him. "I'll be direct with you," he said, which Elsa appreciated even though what followed was not in the end very pleasant. "The railroad has reviewed your situation. The note on this property is 60 days past due. Jakob was a good man, and we've given the estate considerable latitude. But winter is coming and this cabin is not—" He paused, searching for a word that was honest without being cruel, not adequate for what's coming. "I know," Elsa said. He looked at her then with what appeared to be genuine surprise. He had expected her to argue or to cry or to make some claim about managing that would require him to gently dismantle. Her simple acknowledgement seemed to throw his script off balance. "The company is prepared to be generous," he continued, recovering. "We will forgive the remainder of Jacob's debt, all of it. We will provide you with a train ticket to Lancaster. You have family there, I believe, and a sum of money that will allow you to reestablish yourself comfortably. In return, you sign the deed over to us. Clean and clear." He reached into his coat and produced an envelope which he set on the table between them. He did not slide it toward her. He was not threatening. He was simply placing an option in her field of vision the way you might set down a lamp to help someone see more clearly. "You have until the 1st of December, he said. "After that, the railroad will exercise its legal rights regarding the debt. You would leave with considerably less." He looked at the cracking, chinking at the small, cold hearth at the window, where the wind pushed through the ill-fitting frame and stirred the air inside the cabin. "I have seen women try to winter alone on these claims, Mrs. Voss. 3 of them in the past 6 years. I recovered their claims in the spring." He said this with no satisfaction, only with the weight of a man who has seen things he cannot unsee. "I don't want to add your name to that list." Elsa looked at the envelope on the table. She thought about Lancaster. She thought about her mother's narrow house on the narrow street, and the dry goods store, and the manageable winters and the neighbors close enough to hear you call. She thought about what it would mean to walk away from the quarter section that Jakob had loved, from the half-finished barn, and the cracking cabin, and the enormous silence that had his name written all over it, whether she could read it or not. "I'll think about it," she said. Cornelius Hatch put on his hat. "Think quickly," he said, not unkindly. "The cold doesn't wait for decisions." He left. His horse's hoofbeats faded into the flat distance. Elsa stood at the window and watched the sky, which had gone the color of pewter at the horizon, which meant snow before morning. She did not pick up the envelope, but she did not throw it away. What she did instead, after a long time standing at the window, was go to the large trunk at the foot of the bed. It was a heavy thing, battered from the journey west, its leather straps cracked with age and use. She opened it and moved carefully through its contents. Her wedding dress folded in tissue that had yellowed at the edges. 3 of Jakob's shirts still folded the way she had folded them the last time she washed them, a daguerreotype of her parents taken the year before she left Pennsylvania. A lock of hair tied with a ribbon that she did not examine closely. At the bottom, wrapped in a piece of faded blue cloth, was the journal. It had belonged to her grandmother, Oma Britta, who had come to America from Denmark in 1839 at the age of 22, with nothing but a small wooden chest and a head full of knowledge that the new country did not yet know it needed. Oma Britta had been by any measure an extraordinary woman, small and pale-eyed, and possessed of a quiet certainty that Elsa had spent her childhood trying to understand and her adulthood trying to emulate. She had died when Elsa was 12, leaving behind the journal which Elsa's mother had pressed into her hands the morning she left for Dakota with the instruction to keep it safe. Elsa had not opened it in 2 years. She brought it to the table, pushed Hatch's envelope aside, and opened it. The pages smelled of dried lavender, and something older underneath something that was simply the smell of time. The writing was a mixture of Danish and English, the letters small and precise. The ink in places faded to near invisibility. Oma Britta had written recipes and poems and observations about the weather and the behavior of plants, and pressed between the pages were flowers flat and translucent with age, and what appeared to be small samples of different types of soil. Elsa turned pages slowly, carefully, reading in patches, following her grandmother's mind through the years. And then perhaps 40 pages in, she found the section she had not known was there. It was headed in Danish with a word she did not immediately recognize. She sounded it out slowly, the way Oma Britta had taught her to approach unfamiliar Danish. Take the syllables separately. Let each one settle before moving to the next. Jord, varme, hus, earth, heat, house. The pages that followed were different from the rest of the journal. Less poetic, more precise. There were sketches, cross-sections of underground structures drawn with careful attention to proportion, with measurements noted in the margins. There were calculations that Elsa could not fully follow, involving soil depth and insulation values, and something her grandmother called thermal banking. There were drawings of ventilation systems, of stone floors, of angled glass panels set almost flush with the ground. And there was, tucked between these drawings, written in a smaller hand, as though it had been added later, a section that stopped Elsa's breath. Winter of 1843, Minnesota. I built the first version of what I have described above, following principles I learned from my father, who learned them from his father, who survived winters on the Jutland coast that would kill a Dakota man in an afternoon. I built it wrong the first time. I did not follow my own instructions. I placed the stones without adequate dry straw beneath them, because I was impatient, because I was afraid, because the cold was already at the door. The floor cracked on the third night, and the cold came through from below, and I nearly lost the whole enterprise. I had to tear up what I had built in the dark in temperatures that would turn water to ice in minutes, and do it again correctly. I was so tired I could not feel my hands. But I did it again, and the second time it held. It held all winter. The temperature outside fell to 30 below. Inside the earth room I was warm, not hot, not the blazing, greedy warmth of a fire. The quiet, steady warmth of the earth remembering summer. I have written this account for whoever comes after me, whoever needs it. Do not build it wrong to save time. You will lose more time fixing it. Follow the instructions, all of them, even the ones that seem unnecessary, especially those. Elsa read this passage 3 times. She sat with it for a long time. Outside, the wind had picked up, pressing against the cabin walls, with a sound like something impatient waiting. The first light snow had begun to fall, visible in the last gray light of the afternoon, small and precise flakes that were the polite forewarning of something much larger to come. She thought about Oma Britta, whom she had last seen when she was 12 years old. A small woman with pale eyes who had survived things that Elsa was only beginning to understand. She thought about 1843 in Minnesota, about a woman alone in the cold, tearing up a stone floor with numb hands at temperatures that turn water to ice, and then doing it again correctly. She thought about what it cost to do a thing wrong and then do it again. She thought about what it said about a person that they could do that. She closed the journal. She picked up Hatch's envelope and held it for a moment. Then she set it down again unopened on the far end of the table. She put on her coat and her boots and picked up the lantern from the hook by the door and went out into the early dark. The barn was 50 yards from the cabin, a structure that was paradoxically more solid than the cabin it was meant to serve. Jakob had built it first, which was the order of priorities on the plains. Animals needed shelter before people did because animals were income and people were just people. The frame was heavy timber, well-jointed, the roof solid. He had completed it just 3 weeks before the fever came. The floor was packed earth dark and cold beneath the lantern light, with the particular smell of soil that had been sheltered from rain dry and mineral and ancient. Elsa walked the length of the barn, slowly holding the lantern low, watching the ground. She had been in this barn every day for 6 months. She knew its dimensions, its smells, its sounds and wind. But she was looking at it differently now. She was looking at it the way her grandmother had looked at the ground in Minnesota in 1843. Not as a floor, but as a ceiling. Near the center of the barn, she stopped. The ground here was different. Slightly looser, she thought, though she could not have said exactly why she thought so. Something about the way the lantern light fell on it, perhaps, or a slight variation in color. She crouched down and pressed her palm flat against the earth, the way you press your hand to someone's forehead to check for fever. The ground was cold, but here in this section, it felt different. Not warmer exactly, just different. She straightened up and went to the corner of the barn where Jakob had kept his tools. She found the spade a good one solid ash handle, the blade still sharp from the last time she had used it. She drove it into the center of the different feeling section of floor. It went in cleanly, too cleanly. The resistance was less than it should have been for packed earth. She dug. The lantern hung from a nail she had hammered into the nearest timber, casting a pool of yellow light around her. She worked methodically, the way she had seen Jakob work, not frantically, not with wasted motion, but with a steady rhythm that covered ground without burning out the person doing it. Jakob had taught her that. Move at the pace you can sustain, he used to say. A panicked man digs fast and stops. A steady man digs all day. 2 feet down, the spade hit wood, not a root, not a buried branch. Something flat and regular, a plank. She cleared the dirt from around it, working outward from the center, and found another plank beside it, and another. Carefully fitted heavy lumber that had been here for a very long time. She cleared the perimeter of what turned out to be a large rectangle, perhaps 4 feet by 6 feet, and found at one end, half buried in the compressed earth, a thick iron ring. A trapdoor. She stared at it for a long moment, the lantern light making the iron ring glow faintly orange. Then she went back to the corner and got the long timber beam that had been left over from the barn's construction. Jakob had been saving it for the expansion he was planning, and wedged one end under the iron ring. She put her weight on the other end. Nothing. She shifted her grip, moved her feet, and tried again. This time there was a groan, low, structural. The sound of wood and metal that has been bonded by years of rust and compressed earth, being asked to separate. She pushed harder. The groan deepened. And then, with a crack that seemed to split the quiet of the barn in two, the seal broke. The door lifted. 2 inches, then 4, then more as Elsa worked the beam. She got her fingers under the edge and heaved her back, screaming her boots, scrabbling for purchase on the dirt floor. The door rose heavy and resistant, until finally she could push it up and over, and it fell back against the barn floor with the impact that shook the timbers above her head and startled something small in the rafters into a brief panicked flutter. She held the lantern over the opening. Stone steps descended into the dark. 6 of them steep and narrow, slick with damp but solid. She could see the careful way they had been cut and fitted the work of someone who knew what they were doing. Below the steps was darkness, and out of that darkness came a smell that she felt somehow she recognized earth, and mineral cold and stillness, a deep, underground quiet that was entirely different from the silence of the cabin or the silence of the plains. She went down. Each step brought the temperature change she had been hoping for and not quite allowed herself to expect. Not warmth exactly, but the cessation of cold. The killing edge that lived in every cubic foot of Dakota air in October was simply not present down here. The cold existed, but it was a different kind of cold, steady even without ambition, without intent. At the bottom of the steps, she held the lantern up and looked. The cellar was small, perhaps 10 feet by 12, with stone walls that had been built by someone with considerable skill. The stones were fitted close without much mortar in the old European style that relies on careful selection of compatible shapes, rather than on the binding material between them. The ceiling was low arched brick, darkened with age. The floor was dirt packed hard. In the corners, the remnants of wooden shelves had rotted into soft, dark shapes that barely held their form. In the far wall at eye level, someone had carved letters into the stone. Elsa moved the lantern closer. The letters were careful, deliberate, each one cut with patience. She read them once, then again. B. Holmeson, 1869. God willing it holds. She stood very still for a moment. Britta Holmeson, a Scandinavian woman here in Dakota Territory in 1869. 18 years before Elsa had arrived. A woman who had built this cellar with her own hands, who had taken the time in whatever winter or summer or crisis she had faced to cut her name into the stone. Who had ended her inscription, not with a statement of certainty, but with a hope. God willing it holds, and it had held. For 18 years through Dakota winters that Elsa was only beginning to understand this space had held. Whoever Britta Holmeson had been wherever she had gone after this, and Elsa did not know, could not know she had built something that lasted. Elsa sat down on the bottom step. She set the lantern beside her and held the journal in both hands. She looked at the stone walls, at the carved inscription at the low ceiling that the earth above pressed down upon, with the weight of everything above it. The barn floor, the soil, the frost that was even now working its way downward from the surface. But not here, not down here. Here the temperature was, she estimated, around 50 degrees. cold by any household standard, but not the killing cold of the plains. The killing cold stopped above her. The earth, the simple, impassive, ancient earth, was holding it back the way a thick blanket holds back the cold of a winter night. She opened the journal to the Yort-Varmahus section again. She looked at the drawings, the cross-sections, the careful measurements. She looked at the stone walls around her. She thought about Oma Britta tearing up a stone floor with numb hands in Minnesota in 1843 and laying it again correctly because the instructions said to do it that way. And the instructions were right. She thought about Cornelius Hatch's envelope on the table in the cabin, and the train ticket it contained, and the Lancaster street it promised, and the life it represented, manageable, narrow, safe. She thought about Jacob's hands laying these barn timbers. She thought about what he had seen when he looked at this quarter section of prairie. Not what it was, but what it could become. She looked up at the carved letters on the wall. B. Holmeson, 1869. God willing it holds. Then she looked down at the floor, at the packed dirt that was the ceiling of a deeper possibility. She pressed her hand flat against it the way she had pressed her hand against the barn floor above. 50 degrees. Steady. Not fluctuating with the wind, not bleeding heat up through a chimney, not dependent on a dwindling woodpile. Simply there. The way the earth is simply there. She stood up. She picked up the lantern. She went back up the stone steps and into the barn and found the pickaxe in the corner with the other tools. She brought it back to the cellar opening and carried it down. She set it on the dirt floor of the cellar and stood looking at the walls, at the ceiling, at the packed earth floor, at the carved inscription. She was not thinking about Cornelius Hatch. She was not thinking about the train ticket or the debt or the deadline of December 1st. She was thinking about angles of sunlight in winter, about the south-facing wall of the barn, about how deep you had to dig before the ground stopped freezing. She was thinking in the language of the journal, in the precise and practical language that Oma Britta had used to record not a dream, but a method built from failure and correction, and the patience to begin again. She picked up the pickaxe. She drove it into the floor of the cellar with a blow that rang in the stone walls like a bell. Then she did it again. Outside, the snow was falling in earnest now, soft and purposeful, laying the first thin layer of what would become before long a transformation of the landscape so complete that the world of summer would be entirely unrecognizable beneath it. The temperature was dropping. The wind had found the cracks in the cabin walls and was making itself at home. But in the cellar beneath the barn, there was no wind. There was only the ring of iron on packed earth and a young woman in a heavy coat driving a pickaxe into the ground with the steady, sustained rhythm of someone who has decided on a direction and is moving in it. Not frantically, not with wasted motion, at the pace she could sustain. All day if necessary. All winter if necessary. She did not know yet if it would work. She knew that it had worked before for Oma Britta in Minnesota in 1843, for Britta Holmeson in Dakota in 1869. She knew that the physics were real, that the Earth's memory of summer was real, that the difference between fighting the cold and yielding to a deeper warmth was not a poetic idea, but a measurable, practical, physical fact. She knew that every page of her grandmother's journal was the record of someone who had tested these ideas against the hardest possible standard, survival, and found them sound. What she did not know was whether she had enough time, whether she had enough strength, whether the December 1st deadline was a cliff she was already too close to. What she knew was that she was not getting on the train. The pickaxe swung. The earth gave way. Bucket by slow bucket, the cellar began to become something more than it had been. The lantern burned steady in the underground quiet. Above the barn creaked in the rising wind. Above that, the snow came down in the dark, indifferent and thorough, covering the world in its cold white certainty. And beneath all of it, in the only place the wind could not reach Elsa Voss, was building something. The first bucket of dirt she carried up the stone steps and across the barn and dumped outside in the dark weighed, she estimated, about 30 pounds. By the time she had carried the 40th bucket that first night, she had stopped estimating. Weight becomes irrelevant when you have no choice about carrying it. What matters is the next trip and the one after that, and the rhythm you find that makes the next trip possible. She worked by lantern light until her arms stopped working reliably, until the bucket would swing against her leg, without her meaning it to, until she missed the bottom step in the dark and caught herself on the doorframe with a jolt that rattled her teeth. Then she went to the cabin, ate cold cornbread and drank water that was already beginning to develop a skin of ice in the bucket by morning, and slept for 4 hours. Then she went back. November came in on the back of a north wind that meant business. The days were short now, light arriving reluctantly around 7 in the morning and abandoning the land again before 5, as though the sun had somewhere more important to be. In those few hours of gray light, Elsa worked above ground, hauling field stones from the crumbling wall at the eastern edge of her property, loading them into the small wooden cart Jakob had built for moving soil, dragging the cart across the frozen ground to the barn. The stones were heavy, awkward, cold enough to burn the skin through her gloves. Each trip from the wall to the barn covered perhaps 150 yards. She made the trip 6 or 7 times a day when the ground was manageable, fewer when the snow was bad. In the evenings, by lantern light, she worked below. The cellar was deepening. Following the dimensions in Oma Britta's journal, she was excavating a trench along the interior of the stone walls, 3 feet deeper than the existing floor, perhaps 18 inches wide. This trench was the foundation of everything. The journal explained it in the careful, slightly formal English that Oma Britta had written in when she wanted to be precise, as opposed to the more relaxed mixture of Danish and English she used when she was simply thinking on paper. The enemy is not the cold air above, but the frozen ground itself, which in a Dakota winter will penetrate several feet deep and will steal heat from any structure that does not account for it. The trench along the perimeter creates a barrier. The materials in the trench, laid in the correct order, become a system. Think of it not as a floor, but as a slow machine for storing summer. A slow machine for storing summer. Elsa repeated this to herself sometimes while she worked in the rhythm of the pickaxe or the scrape of the shovel. It was the kind of phrase that got into you. Not because it was pretty, though it was, but because it was accurate. The earth below the frost line was not cold in the way that the air was cold. It was stable. It held its temperature the way a good stone wall holds its shape. Not dramatically, not with any particular effort, simply by virtue of what it was made of and how deep it went. Into the bottom of the trench she packed dry straw, hauled from the corner of the barn, where Jakob had stored it for animals he had intended to buy the following spring. The straw went in 8 inches deep, tamped down firmly but not compressed. It needed to hold its air pockets to insulate effectively. Then she began laying the stones. This was the work that nearly broke her. Each stone had to be carried down the narrow stone steps carefully, with both hands. Her back carrying the weight since her arms could not manage the angles, and then set precisely into the trench in a way that would create a stable, even surface when all the stones were in place. Some of the field stones were well suited to this and went in cleanly. Others were the wrong shape or the wrong thickness and had to be discarded, dragged back up the steps, swapped for a different stone from the pile in the barn. There was no shortcut to this. The stones had to fit or they would not work. On the 6th day of November, she dropped a stone on her left hand. Not a catastrophic injury. 2 fingers badly bruised, not broken, she thought, though she could not be certain. She sat on the cellar floor with her hand between her knees and breathed through the pain with the focused, deliberate breathing that Oma Britta had once described to her as the oldest medicine in the world. Just breathe. Let the pain exist. Do not fight it. Do not catastrophize it. Just breathe until it settles into something manageable, and then decide what to do next. What she did next was wrap the fingers tightly with a strip of cloth torn from a shirt she could no longer use anyway, and continue laying stone. She was 12 days into the work. The trench was almost complete. The stone floor extending across perhaps 2/3 of the cellar, when she found the passage in the journal that she had read before, but not carefully enough. It was on page 47, written in smaller letters than the surrounding text, as though it had been added as an afterthought or a warning. She had registered it on her first reading and moved past it, impatient to get to the larger design. She understood now, in the particular way you understand things only after they have cost you something, that Oma Britta had not written anything as an afterthought. On the matter of the stone floor, I must be very clear about this, because I was not clear with myself the first time, and it nearly ruined everything. Do not place the stones directly onto the earth or onto the straw layer. You must first lay a bed of dry sand 2 inches deep over the straw before the stones go in. The sand levels the surface, distributes the weight, and prevents the moisture in the soil from wicking upward into the stone and conducting cold upward through your floor. I skipped this step in 1843 because I had no sand available and I believed the straw would be sufficient. It was not sufficient. The floor cracked on the 3rd night when the heat from above met the cold moisture from below, and the differential caused the stones to shift and separate. Do not make my mistake. Find the sand. Elsa sat with the journal in her lap and looked at the stone floor she had laid. 2/3 complete 8 days of work, somewhere between 300 and 400 stones moved by hand down a narrow staircase. She pressed her palm flat against the surface. It felt solid. It felt like it might hold. She looked at the far end of the cellar where she had not yet laid stone. She looked at the section she had already completed. She thought about the 3rd night. She thought about cracking. She thought about what it would mean to discover this problem. Not now in relative calm, but in the middle of January with a blizzard outside and no way to fix it. She thought about Oma Britta on the Jutland coast and in Minnesota in 1843, tearing up a stone floor with numb hands because she had skipped a step she had known about. Doing it again correctly because the instructions were right. Elsa stood up. She went up the steps and across the barn and hitched the cart to nothing. She had no horse, so she pulled it herself and went to the dry creek bed a quarter-mile east of the property where she had noticed during the summer a deposit of pale fine sand laid down by some ancient water event. The ground above it was frozen solid, but the sand itself, several inches below the surface, was workable. She dug it out with her hands, and the small trowel from Jacob's tool collection filled the cart and hauled it back. Then she took up the section of stone floor she had already laid, stone by stone back up the steps, stacked in the barn. The straw layer, disturbed and now somewhat compressed, had to come out and be replaced with fresh. Then the sand went down 2 inches, leveled by hand. Then the stones went back one by one down the steps, set into place with the care and patience of someone who understood now at a cellular level what happened when you did this wrong. It took 3 days. At the end of those 3 days, she had a floor that was worse in condition than when she had started, slightly less than what she had before raw and reassembled, but built correctly. She did not allow herself to feel the loss of those 3 days. She simply noted them and moved on. It was on the 14th of November she kept careful track of dates, marking them each morning with a line scratched into the doorframe of the cabin, that Marta Jensen came. Elsa heard the horse before she saw it, the sound carrying clearly in the cold, still air of mid-morning. She came up from the cellar, dusty and sore, and found Marta Jensen standing at the entrance to the barn, with a look on her face that was complicated in ways Elsa did not immediately have the energy to parse. Marta Jensen was a Norwegian woman of 40 or so, square-built and steady, with the kind of face that weathers well because it was not particularly delicate to begin with. Her husband had died 2 years earlier, not of fever, but of a farm accident, the specific and unromantic kind of death that the plains dealt to people with no particular sentiment about it. She ran her homestead alone now, competently, without apparent bitterness, in the way that some women manage grief by converting it entirely into productivity. She did not come inside the barn. She stood at the entrance and looked at the mound of excavated dirt outside, and at the cart with its load of field stones, and at Elsa covered in dust and dried mud, her bruised fingers wrapped in cloth, her eyes clear and direct. Marta looked for a long time without speaking. Then she reached into the wagon behind her and produced a large cloth sack, which she set down on the ground inside the barn entrance. Inside the sack, Elsa found this when she opened it, after Marta had turned her wagon around and started back. Without a word were 2 things. The first was a covered tin pail of bean soup, still warm inside its wrapping of burlap. The second was 2 window sashes, good ones with the glass still intact. 18-inch by 24-inch frames, the glass thick and slightly rippled in the way of good window glass made in that era. Someone had packed them carefully for transport, the glass protected by strips of cloth tied between the frames. Elsa held one of the sashes and looked at the glass. She knew without needing to be told what these had been. Marta's husband had ordered them the winter before he died for the expanded house he was planning to build. They had been sitting in Marta's barn for 2 years. They were the kind of thing a woman keeps because her husband valued them, and she cannot yet bring herself to treat his values as irrelevant. Elsa set the sashes down very carefully against the barn wall. She picked up the tin pail of soup. She sat on the dirt floor of the barn and ate the soup without a bowl, drinking it directly from the pail while it was still warm. And she did not cry. She had not cried since the morning after Jakob died, and she had not cried since then. and she did not cry now. But she held the warm pail in her bruised hands for a long time after the soup was gone, simply absorbing the warmth of it, the specific warmth of something prepared by someone else's hands, with some portion of care for the person who would receive it. Then she got up and went back to work. The skylight was the most technically demanding part of the project, and she left it for when she had the clarity and physical reserve to do it correctly. The principle was simple. Oma Britta had drawn it out with the careful precision of an engineer. But simple principles often require careful execution. On the south-facing wall of the barn, the wall that received the most hours of low winter sun, she needed to dig a trench angling downward from the surface to the cellar wall. The trench would be covered with the window glass, creating a sloped surface that would catch the winter sun low on the horizon in Dakota from November through February, and direct both light and solar heat downward into the cellar. She chose her spot carefully. The journal specified the angle not too steep, not too shallow, calibrated for the latitude and the angle of the winter sun at this position on the earth. Oma Britta had done the calculation years ago and written it down in the margin. At 45 degrees north, the winter sun at noon sits approximately 21 degrees above the horizon. The glass panel should be angled to face it directly. This maximizes both light and heat gain. Elsa dug the trench over 2 days, working from both ends, from the surface downward and from the cellar wall outward. When the two excavations met in the middle, she spent an hour simply looking through the opening, watching the pale November light come through. Even without glass, even on an overcast day, the difference was immediate and physical. Light in the cellar, air moving. The underground room suddenly connected to the world above in a way that made it feel less like burial and more like shelter. She built the wooden frame for the glass over the course of an afternoon, using lumber from the barn's construction remnants and the hammer and nails from Jacob's tool collection. The frame had to be solid. It would bear the weight of snow, and it had to seal tightly against the barn wall at the top and the cellar wall at the bottom to prevent cold air from coming through the edges. She fitted, checked it, adjusted it, and fitted again. Then she set Marta's window sashes into the frame. The glass caught the late afternoon light and threw it down into the cellar in a long diagonal beam that struck the unfinished stone floor and scattered into a dozen smaller reflections off the uneven surfaces of the stones. Elsa stood at the bottom of the cellar steps and watched the light move across the floor, and she understood for the first time in a way that was not theoretical what her grandmother had meant by the earth remembering summer. The light was winter light, thin, horizontal, without much heat in it today. But it was there. And come January, when the sun dropped even lower, and the angle of incidence matched the angle of the glass, exactly, it would do more than illuminate. It would warm. She sat down on the stone floor in the diagonal beam of light and stayed there for a while. The ventilation problem she solved in a way she had not anticipated and could not have planned for. In the back corner of the cellar, behind the remnants of the rotted shelving, she found a feature of the original construction that had not been obvious on first inspection. The beginning of what appeared to be a flue. A vertical channel cut into the stone wall. She cleared the debris from around it carefully by hand, because the wall in this area was old, and she did not want to disturb what was holding it together, and found that the channel ran upward through the stone and disappeared into the earth above. Somewhere above it connected to the original chimney structure of the previous homesteader's house, long since collapsed. But the channel itself was intact. She spent a day cleaning it, a claustrophobic, dirty process of inserting her arm as far as it would go and pulling out compacted dirt and small stones and what appeared to be a bird's nest of considerable antiquity until she could feel air moving in it. Faint, barely perceptible, but present. A slow exchange of air pulling up from the cellar and out through the old chimney passage above. It was not a strong draft, but it was enough. Enough to prevent the buildup of bad air, enough to keep the space breathable over extended periods. Oma Britta had written about this in the journal, the crucial importance of ventilation in any below-ground living space. A sealed room seems safer but is not. Air like fire needs to move to remain healthy. Find the movement. If it does not exist, create it. A small hole rightly placed is worth more than a large room poorly ventilated. The flue was not a small hole. It was better than a small hole. It was a miracle of accidental alignment, a feature of someone else's long-ago construction that had waited 18 years to be useful again. On the 20th of November, Cornelius Hatch came back. He rode in from the North Road with another man beside him. A broad, ruddy-faced individual in a good wool coat who had the look of a working farmer. Rather than a speculator, someone whose hands showed the same evidence of labor that Elsa's did, though presumably under better conditions. Hatch's expression when he came in sight of the barn was one that Elsa, watching from the barn doorway, had not seen on him before. It was not contempt, and it was not condescension. It was something more uncomfortable than either. It was uncertainty which on a man like Cornelius Hatch wore itself as a kind of tightening around the eyes, a slight hardening of the jaw. They dismounted and walked toward the barn. The mound of excavated dirt outside was now very large. Several weeks of bucket-by-bucket removal had produced a hill of dark earth that was in its way a monument to the work Elsa had done. You could not look at it without understanding that someone had moved it all by hand, one bucket at a time. Hatch looked at it. The other man looked at it and then looked at Elsa. "This is Mr. Gunderson," Hatch said by way of introduction. "He farms outside of Fargo. He's been looking for an opportunity to expand." He said this in the tone of a man reminding a weaker party of the strength of his position. Gunderson nodded at Elsa with the brief, practical nod of a man who does not waste social energy on situations he has already assessed. But his eyes were on the barn, and then on the mound of dirt, and then on the hole in the south-facing wall of the barn where the skylight frame was now installed, the glass glinting in the November gray. "What's that?" he said. Not to Hatch, to Elsa. "A solar collector," Elsa said. "It directs winter sunlight into the structure below." Gunderson looked at her. He had the face of a man who had spent 30 years forming rapid and generally accurate judgments about practical things. "Below," he repeated. "You're heating something underground." "I'm storing heat in stone. Below the frost line, yes." There was a silence. Gunderson looked at the skylight, at the mound of dirt, at Elsa's wrapped fingers and dust-coated coat. He was working something out. Hatch waited with the impatience of a man whose script has been interrupted by an unscheduled development. "What's the temperature down there?" Gunderson asked. "At present, without having run the charging fire yet, around 50 degrees. Consistent regardless of the surface temperature." Gunderson turned to Hatch. "Can I look at it?" Hatch's expression shifted. He had not expected this question, and did not know how to answer it without either endorsing Elsa's work, which violated his purposes, or refusing to let a potential buyer examine a feature of the property which violated his other purposes. He managed a kind of non-committal gesture that Gunderson interpreted as permission. Elsa led them down the steps. She held the lantern. Behind her, she heard Gunderson's boots on the stone steps, and then Hatch's heavier tread. In the cellar, she held the lantern high and let them look. The stone floor not yet complete, but mostly done, the gaps at the far end still showing raw earth reflected the lantern light in the amber of old rock. The south wall where the skylight opening came through showed a bar of pale daylight that lay across the floor like a promise. The temperature was what it always was down here, unchanging, steady, indifferent to the wind above. Gunderson crouched down and pressed his palm flat against the stone floor. He stayed in that position for a long time. Elsa watched him and did not speak. She understood what he was doing. He was feeling it, the steadiness, the absolute absence of the fluctuation that defined every surface structure in Dakota Territory in November. He was a farmer. His hands knew ground the way a musician's hands know keys. He was reading something. "How much wood does it take?" he asked. "For the charging fire, 4 to 5 hours of hot burning every 2 to 3 days. Perhaps a cord and a half for the entire winter at that rate." Gunderson stood up. He looked at the stone walls, at the carved inscription. B. Holmeson, 1869, at the ceiling, at the ventilation flue in the corner. He looked at the skylight panel. The pale light coming through. He was doing a calculation that Hatch was watching him do, and Hatch did not like the result that the calculation appeared to be producing. "Cord and a half," Gunderson said, almost to himself. "I burn 6 cords minimum. Some winters 8. He turned and went back up the steps without another word. Hatch followed. Elsa came last, pulling the cellar door closed behind her. Outside, Gunderson stood looking at the property, the barn, the cabin, the mound of dirt, the frozen fields. "I'll be in touch," he said to Hatch, but he said it in a tone that did not mean what Hatch wanted it to mean. It meant, "I need to think about this." It meant what I just felt down there is something I was not prepared for. It meant the conversation I came here to have is not the conversation I'm leaving with. They rode away. Hatch glanced back once, and Elsa was still standing in the barn doorway, and she met his gaze with the same direct, unhurried steadiness that she had been practicing since October. And he looked away first. She went back down the steps. The charging fire was a problem she had been working toward and thinking about simultaneously since she had first read the journal. The principle was clear: she needed a way to generate intense, concentrated heat that would drive warmth downward into the stone floor without filling the cellar with smoke and without requiring a constant fire that would exhaust her fuel supply in weeks. Oma Britta's solution was elegant and specific, and Elsa had been planning its implementation since the second week of November. Jacob had owned a large cast-iron rendering pot, a cauldron of the sort used for soap making or processing lard, at slaughter time perhaps 30 inches across and 18 deep. It was massive, too heavy to move without equipment. Elsa did not try to move it. Instead, using the same timber lever system she had used to open the cellar door, she maneuvered it in stages across the barn floor to a position directly above the cellar entrance. She built a stone platform for it there, a cylinder of mortared fieldstones perhaps 2 feet high that elevated the pot and created an air gap beneath it. In the barn roof directly above the pot, she cut a hole. It was the most nerve-wracking hour of the entire project, standing on a ladder with Jacob's brace and bit, drilling through the solid timber roof boards 1 careful inch at a time, trying not to think about what she was doing to the structural integrity of the one building on the property that was genuinely solid. The hole, when finished, was roughly 8 inches across, large enough to draw smoke efficiently, small enough not to compromise the roof structurally, she hoped. In the stone floor of the cellar, directly below where the pot would sit, she left a corresponding opening. A square gap in the stones, perhaps 12 inches across, leading to a small pit lined with flat stones that she had excavated specifically for this purpose. This pit was the receiving end of the system. The heat from the fire in the pot above would radiate downward through the cast iron, which conducts and re-radiates heat extremely efficiently, and pour through the opening, heating the air in the pit, which would then radiate outward into the stone floor and the stone walls. The system worked like a fireplace in reverse. The smoke went up and out of the living space entirely. The heat went down into the mass of stone where it would be stored and slowly released over the following 48 hours. On the 25th of November, she tested it for the first time. She filled the pot with the driest, fastest-burning wood she had split, pine bone dry from being stored inside the barn, and lit it with her flint and steel and a handful of dry grass. The fire caught quickly, the way dry pine catches, with an immediate enthusiasm that produced both heat and smoke in quantity. The smoke moved where she had designed it to move, upward through the hole in the roof, out into the cold November air above. She stood in the barn and watched the smoke curl through the hole and dissipate in the wind, and felt a relief so physical it was almost embarrassing. Then she went down the steps. The heat arrived before she expected it. She was halfway down the staircase when she felt it. Not the specific dry heat of a fire, but something more diffuse, more general. The air at the bottom of the steps was noticeably warmer than it had been. She stood over the pit opening in the stone floor and held her hand above it, and felt the column of heat rising through, not hot enough to burn, but substantial, consistent, the kind of warmth that makes you understand in a physical way how much energy a well-fed fire produces. She let the fire burn for 4 hours, going up every 30 minutes to feed it. Each time she descended, the cellar was measurably warmer. Not dramatically, this was not the instant aggressive heat of a stove. This was gradual, patient, the way the earth itself changes temperature. By the time she let the fire die down, the cellar was at 58 degrees. The stones in the floor were warm to the touch, not hot, but warm the way a sun-heated rock is warm, with a stored quality that you could feel was more than surface. She covered the opening in the stone floor with a thick, flat stone she had selected for this purpose, sealing the heat in the cellar and closing off the draft that would otherwise carry it upward. Then she sat on the floor and waited. An hour later, the cellar was 61 degrees. 2 hours later, 63. The stones were doing exactly what Oma Britta had said they would do. They were releasing what they had absorbed slowly, evenly, without drama or exhaustion. There was no fire burning. There was no wood being consumed. There was simply the stone floor of the cellar, warm with the memory of the fire she had built 2 hours ago, radiating that warmth into the air around it. at a rate that was too slow to feel like a source, but too steady to be anything else. She took off her coat. She sat in the cellar in her dress and her boots with her coat across her knees, and the temperature was 63 degrees in a Dakota. November, 2 feet below a barn floor and 10 feet below a prairie that was experiencing nighttime lows of -5. And she had done this. She had done this with a pickaxe and a shovel, and 200 field stones in a cast iron pot, and the patience to undo 3 days of work and do it again correctly, and the wisdom of a woman who had been dead for 17 years, and a window sash donated in silence by a neighbor who understood loss. She thought about Oma Britta. Not the concept of her, not the legend of her, the actual woman, small and pale-eyed, who had failed in Minnesota in 1843, and had written it down so that someone else would not fail the same way, who had turned her failure into a gift by the simple act of being precise about it, who had trusted that someone would come after her who needed what she had learned. She thought about the inscription on the wall. B. Holmson, 1869. God willing it holds. It held. It had held for 18 years without anyone to tend it, without anyone to know it was there. It had held through winters that the old-timers described in a particular tone reserved for things that cannot be fully explained to someone who was not present. It had held, and now it was holding again for a different woman with a different name and the same problem and the same answer. She moved her few necessary possessions down to the cellar over the next 3 days. The mattress from the cabin bed carried in stages down the narrow steps, her quilts, the lantern and the oil for it, the stores of food, potatoes, onions, dried beans, the jars of preserved summer fruit that she had put up in August when she was still operating on the assumption that she would be using them from the cabin. The journal. She left the cabin standing. She would need it in the spring, and its present smoke from the chimney occasionally when she maintained a small fire for appearances would be less alarming to anyone passing than an apparently abandoned homestead. She did not want anyone investigating too closely. She did not want to explain herself until the explanation could include the outcome. On the evening of the 30th of November, one day before Cornelius Hatch's deadline, she ran the charging fire for the second time. 4 hours of hot, clean burning. The cellar reached 65 degrees. She covered the pit opening with the flat stone and went to her bed. Outside, the temperature dropped to -12. Inside the cellar, the temperature held at 62 degrees through the night. She lay on the mattress in the dark, with the journal on the pillow beside her, and listened to the silence. There was no wind down here. The wind existed, she could feel it in some distant peripheral way. A faint vibration in the earth above her that was not quite sound and not quite sensation, but it was not present. It had no access to this space. It could not reach her here. She thought about what she would say to Cornelius Hatch tomorrow. She thought about how to explain to a man who had built his life around fighting the cold that there was another way, that the fighting was not necessary, that yield could be a form of strength. She thought about whether he would be capable of hearing it, or whether he was too fully committed to his own logic to receive a challenge to it. She thought for a while about Jakob, about his hands on the timbers of the barn above her, about the fact that the barn he had built, imperfect, unfinished, not what he had planned, had turned out to be exactly what she needed. Not in the way he had planned it, but in a deeper way. in the way that things you build with genuine care tend to serve purposes beyond the ones you intended. She fell asleep without meaning to. One moment she was thinking and the next she was not. And between those two moments there was nothing but the deep, wordless dark of the earth holding her steady. Above on the Dakota plains, the temperature outside continued to fall. The sky was a hard black dome salted with stars of absolute indifference. The wind moved across the flatland with nothing to stop it for 300 miles in any direction. It was the kind of night that the plains were made of, the kind of night that had ended 1,000 stories on this prairie, final and absolute. In the cellar beneath the barn, Elsa Voss slept without shivering for the first time since October. The stone floor held its warmth. The walls held their quiet. The earth held everything. Above her head, unseen in the dark, a horse came along the north road at a slow walk. It was Cornelius Hatch riding past before his morning appointment, unable to sleep himself, coming to see if there was anything to see. He came level with the barn and slowed. Through the gap between the barn doors, a thin line of light was visible, the lantern still burning low on its shelf. Not the light of a fire, not the frantic light of someone struggling to stay warm. Just a steady, quiet glow. He sat on his horse for a moment in the -12 night, looking at that line of light. His breath made clouds in the air. His horse shifted beneath him, wanting to move and keep warm. He turned the horse and rode back toward his house, his large timber and iron house with its cast iron stove and its enormous woodpile and its walls thick enough to make a man believe he could hold the winter at bay by sheer force of construction. He rode home, but he rode home different from how he had come. Some small part of the certainty had come loose. He did not acknowledge this even to himself. But it was loose, and the wind of the ride home did not put it back. Cornelius Hatch arrived at precisely 9 o'clock on the morning of December 1st. He was a man who kept his appointments. In his experience, the keeping of appointments was a form of authority. It communicated that your time had value, and that you expected others to organize themselves around that value. He had ridden through a morning that was brutally cold, the sky a hard, polished blue, that meant the temperature would not rise above 0 today, regardless of what the sun attempted. His horse's breath came in great white plumes. The ground rang under the hooves like iron. The cabin was dark. He had seen this before, the dark cabin, the abandoned claim, and he recognized it with a feeling he chose not to examine too closely. He dismounted and pushed the cabin door open. The cold inside was identical to the cold outside. The water bucket in the corner had frozen solid, a perfect cylinder of opaque ice. A thin layer of frost had formed on the inside of the window glass. The hearth was cold and dark, not the cold of a fire allowed to die down overnight, but the absolute cold of a space that had not been heated in days. He stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the frost on the glass and the ice in the bucket. She had left, or she was dead. The claim was his. He stepped back outside. He scanned the property with the automatic efficiency of a man who assessed land for a living, the cabin, the barn, the frozen fields beyond. And then he noticed what he should have noticed when he arrived. What he had perhaps not allowed himself to notice: there were no tracks leading away from the property. The snow from 2 nights ago lay undisturbed between the cabin and the road. If she had left before the snow, and she had left without her horse, which was still visible through the gap in the barn door. A dark shape in the dimness, breath rising in slow clouds. His eyes moved to the barn. The thin line of light was still there between the doors. Steady, quiet. He walked to the barn. She was sitting on a three-legged stool near the center of the space, Jakob's old coat across her lap. A needle moving in and out of the worn wool with the steady patience of someone who has all the time she needs. She looked up when he came in, but did not stand. The horse regarded him briefly from the far end of the barn and returned to its hay. A thin plume of smoke drifted from the hole in the barn roof above the rendering pot, which was cold now. The fire from 2 days ago, long since burned out. "You're still here," he said. "I am," she said. He looked at the cabin visible through the open barn door. He looked back at her. "You cannot be living in the cabin. It is below freezing in there." "I am not living in the cabin." His gaze moved to the stone slab covering the cellar entrance. It was different from the surrounding floor, darker, more deliberate, the edges squared and fitted with care. He had seen it on his visit in November, but had dismissed it as a cover for the root cellar the previous homesteader had reportedly left. He walked to it now and crouched down and pressed the flat of his hand against the stone. He felt it immediately, a faint warmth rising through the stone from below. He stayed crouched for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, his hand flat on the stone, his face doing something that might, in a different man, have been called wonder, but which on Cornelius Hatch arranged itself as a deep and troubled frown. Then he stood up. "I want to see it," he said. It was not quite a request and not quite a demand. It was the voice of a man who has encountered something he does not understand and has decided that understanding it is more important than maintaining his position. Elsa set down the coat and the needle and moved the stone slab. The warmth came up immediately. The specific warmth of the cellar at 63 degrees rising into a barn that was perhaps 20 degrees and meeting the transition with a clarity you could feel on your face. She went down first. He followed the stone steps, taking his weight with the solidity of good construction, the temperature rising with each step, in the way that still surprised her. Each time, the way a thing you know intellectually continues to surprise you physically, because the body has its own understanding that is separate from the mind's. He stood at the bottom of the steps and looked. The cellar was exactly what it was. Small stone-walled, low-ceilinged, lit by the lantern hanging from its nail, and by the diagonal shaft of December sunlight coming through the skylight panel. The stone floor was warm underfoot. She could see him register this through the soles of his boots. That slight shift of a person recalibrating a sensation they expected to be cold and have discovered is not. The bed was against the far wall, neatly made. A book lay open on it. On the small shelf she had constructed from barn lumber, a few jars and tins were arranged with orderly practicality. The journal sat on the shelf beside them. Cornelius Hatch was a man who had built things his entire life. He understood construction at a level that was not intellectual but physical. The way carpenters understand wood, the way blacksmiths understand metal. Standing in this cellar, he was reading what had been built here, the way a man reads a text in his own language, not translating, simply understanding. He crouched down and pressed his palm flat against the stone floor. He held it there. He was feeling the temperature, yes, but he was also feeling something else, the quality of the warmth. Its evenness, its persistence, the fact that it was not coming from any visible source, that there was no fire burning, no fuel being consumed, that the warmth was simply there, held in the stone from some previous charging releasing itself, at a rate that the stone determined and not the fire. He stood up slowly. "How much wood?" he said. Not a question exactly. A calculation beginning. "A cord and a half for the winter," Elsa said, "at the rate of 4 to 5 hours of charging fire every 2 to 3 days." The silence that followed was long enough that she heard from above them the sound of wind picking up outside. The sky this morning had the quality of a statement about to be made. "I burned 7 cords," Hatch said. He was not talking to her. He was talking to the wall, or to the stone floor, or to some internal version of himself that was attempting to reconcile what it was feeling with what it had believed for 30 years. On a hard winter 8, he looked at the skylight, the pale December light coming through at its precise, calibrated angle. He looked at the ventilation flue in the corner. He looked at the carved inscription on the far wall. B. Holmeson, 1869. God willing it holds, and he looked at it long enough that Elsa understood he was reading it fully, taking in not just the name and the date, but the grammar of it, the hoping quality of it, the faith a person encodes in stone when they are not entirely certain, but are proceeding anyway. He turned and went back up the steps without speaking. She followed him up. He stood in the barn, his hat in his hands, looking at the rendering pot on its stone platform, at the hole in the roof above it, at the opening in the stone floor below it. He was reconstructing the system. She could see him doing it the way an engineer reverse engineers a mechanism he has encountered in the field, tracing the logic following the heat from the fire in the pot downward through the iron, downward through the opening into the stone floor below. "The iron radiates downward," he said. "Yes." "And the stone stores it." "Yes." He put his hat back on. He looked at her. She met his gaze with the same directness she had maintained since October. Not defiant, not triumphant, simply present. Steady. A woman who had done what she said she would do, and did not need to perform it for anyone. "I will be back," he said, "when the real cold comes." He rode away. Elsa watched him go, then went back down the steps, picked up the coat and the needle, and continued her mending. The real cold came 11 days later, the morning of January 12th, 1888. The sky was wrong. Every experienced person on the Dakota Plains felt it before they could name it a quality to the air. A stillness that was not peaceful, but loaded the way a room goes quiet before something significant happens. The temperature at dawn was around 20 degrees, which by January standards was almost mild. The sky was a flat, uniform gray-yellow that gave the light a sickly submarine quality. Birds that should have been dormant appeared briefly and then vanished. The horses were nervous. At 11 o'clock in the morning, the temperature was still hovering around 15 degrees. Children were in school. Farmers were in their fields or in their barns. People had allowed themselves the small luxury of believing the day would be ordinary. The storm arrived from the northwest at what witnesses later described as a wall, not a gradual increase in wind and snow, but a literal wall of white that moved across the plain at a speed that made rational response almost impossible. The temperature dropped 52 degrees in under 3 hours. The wind went from calm to hurricane force between one breath and the next. The snow it carried was not the ordinary Dakota snow of individual flakes, but a fine powdered mass that moved horizontally and penetrated every gap in every structure with the single-minded efficiency of something that intended to be everywhere at once. People caught outside had seconds to decide. Most of those decisions determined whether they lived or died. In his house, the largest, most solidly constructed house in the county, the house that was the material expression of his life's philosophy, Cornelius Hatch fed his monarch stove with the unhurried confidence of a man in his own fortress. The first hour of the storm was in a way that would later strike him as darkly instructive, indistinguishable from any other bad Dakota day. The stove was hot. The house was warm. The walls were thick. He had 7 cords of wood stacked in the protected lean-to on the east side of the house, enough for the entire winter. He was not afraid. His wife, Margaret, was a practical woman of 48 who had survived 14 Dakota winters and had no romantic illusions about any of them. She stood at the window and watched the storm come and said nothing, which was her way of saying more than words could manage. Their son Henry, who was 6 and had not yet learned to read weather the way his parents did, was sitting near the stove with a picture book, occasionally asking questions about the bears in the illustrations. By the second hour, the house was working harder. The stove was consuming wood at a rate that Hatch had not seen outside of the very worst winter nights. And the worst winter nights did not typically arrive at midday. The thick walls, which in ordinary cold created a stable internal temperature through simple mass, were now conducting cold at a rate that the stove was struggling to overcome. The wind found the seams, there were always seams in even the most carefully built structure, and drove the fine powder snow through them in thin, steady streams that collected in small white lines on the interior windowsills. The temperature in the room began to drop, not dramatically, not all at once. The way the tide comes in incrementally, insistently, each small change easy to dismiss until the accumulation becomes impossible to ignore. Hatch fed the stove. He filled it to its maximum capacity, cast iron glowing a dark, threatening red. The wood disappeared into it at a rate he was now calculating with the specific anxiety of a man watching a resource deplete faster than he had planned for. Margaret brought blankets. She wrapped Henry in them without explanation, and the boy, reading his mother's face, did not object. She then went to the window and looked out at the world, which was no longer visible. There was only white, a total and absolute white that had replaced everything that had previously existed beyond the glass. She turned and looked at Hatch. She did not speak. She did not need to. 14 years of marriage had given them a language that operated below words, and what she communicated in that look was clear and devastating. How long can the wood last at this rate? And what do we do when it is gone? He had no answer. He added another log to the fire. By nightfall, the temperature in the room had fallen to 40 degrees. They were wearing everything they owned. The wood pile, which he had calculated would last the entire winter at normal consumption rates, was somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 depleted. He did not go to look at it exactly because he did not want to know exactly. The stove was working at its absolute maximum, and it was not enough. The walls were bleeding heat faster than the fire could replace it. Frost was forming on the interior walls, delicate crystalline patterns that in other circumstances might have been beautiful. Henry coughed. It was a small sound. A child's cough, the kind that might mean anything or nothing. but in the context of 40 degrees, in a supposedly insulated house, in the context of a storm that showed no sign of ending, in the context of a woodpile that was moving toward exhaustion. In that context, the sound was enormous. Margaret pulled the boy closer. She did not look at her husband. Hatch sat in the chair nearest the stove and thought about the girl in the hole in the ground. He thought about the stone floor warm under his palm at 63 degrees. He thought about the diagonal bar of pale sunlight on the cellar floor. He thought about the inscription, "God willing it holds," and about a woman in 1869 who had built something in the earth and trusted it, and about a girl in 1887 who had found it and trusted it further, and about himself sitting in his fortress of timber and iron which was losing. He thought about the word she had used. Not fighting. Yielding. Building beneath the cold instead of against it. He thought about the cord and a half. The wind shook the house at intervals, not as gusts but as sustained blows, as though something very large was trying to find the weakness in the structure, and patient and powerful was working its way around the perimeter looking for it. The frost on the interior walls was thickening. Henry coughed again. Hatch stood up. He told Margaret he was going out for more wood from the lean-to. It was not a complete lie. He did go to the lean-to first, and he stood there, in the protected space, looking at what remained of the wood and doing the arithmetic with the specific, clear-eyed precision of a man who has run out of the option of optimism. The arithmetic was simple. The storm showed no signs of ending. The wood at current consumption rate would last perhaps another day, possibly less if the temperature continued to fall. He went back inside and told Margaret to dress Henry in every layer available. He found the rope on the hook by the door and tied one end to the porch railing. He wrapped himself in wool and oilskin and pulled his heaviest fur hat down until it covered his ears entirely. Margaret watched him without asking where he was going because she already knew or suspected or had decided not to know. He stepped off the porch. The storm took him immediately, not gradually immediately. The wind was a physical thing, a weight that pressed against his chest and found the gaps in his clothing with the efficient malice of something that had been designed for exactly this purpose. The snow was not falling. It was traveling horizontal and dense, a billion small knives moving at the speed of the wind. He could see nothing beyond his own extended arm. Nothing. The world beyond arm's length was pure white noise. He navigated by memory. He had ridden the road between his property and Elsa Voss's claim hundreds of times. He knew the distance a little less than a mile, and he knew the terrain, the gentle rise 200 yards from his gate, the slight left curve where the road followed the old creek bed, the fence line that ran the last 300 yards to her barn. He could not see any of these things. He felt for them. He moved at a crouch rope paying out behind him, and he felt for the shape of the land under his feet. He fell. More than once. The fourth time he stayed down for a moment, cheek against the snow wind screaming overhead, and he understood in a way that was entirely physical and entirely without abstraction that he was in serious danger. He was a large, strong man in heavy clothing, and he was in serious danger. If he had miscalculated, if the Voss property was further than he remembered, or if he had drifted off the line, he might not make it. He got up. He moved forward, because Henry was coughing in a house with a depleting woodpile. and there was no other direction available. The fence line found him, or he found it, at a moment when he had begun to accept that he might not find it. His outstretched hand struck the wire with a force that numbed his fingers, and he grabbed it and held it and followed it hand over hand toward where the barn had to be. The barn door was on the latch but not locked. He fell through it into the relative calm of the interior relative because the wind still found its way through the barn seams. But it was reduced to something that could be called wind rather than annihilation. He lay on the barn floor for a moment and breathed. And the breathing was difficult because his chest had gone tight with cold and exertion. And he allowed himself 30 seconds of stillness before he raised his head. The stone slab. He crawled to it on his hands and knees, which he recognized as an indignity and did not care about. He found the edge of the slab and pressed his palm against it. The warmth was there, immediate, steady, impossible under the circumstances, and absolutely real. He pounded on the slab with his fist. 3 blows hard. His frozen hand barely felt them. He heard something below movement, the soft sound of boots on stone. Then a scraping as the slab shifted. The warmth came up in a wave, the warmth of 62 degrees, meeting the near zero of the barn. And in the wave was something else, something he had not anticipated, something that entered him through a sense he had not expected to be implicated in this moment. Bread. The smell of bread, fresh baked, the specific warm yeast and crust smell of bread that has just come out of heat. Bread that someone has made in the past few hours. Bread that exists because someone is alive and comfortable enough to bake. Elsa's face appeared in the opening below him. She was looking up at him with an expression that he would remember for the rest of his life. Not triumph, not vindication, not the satisfaction of a person whose position has been proved correct. Simply surprise. And below the surprise, immediate practical assessment. She looked at his frost-rimed beard, his eyes red from wind, his hands which were shaking with cold. So severe it had moved past, shaking into something more fundamental. And she said with the calm of a person who has already decided what the situation requires, "Come down." He half fell down the stone steps, his legs not entirely reliable, his hands gripping the stone wall for balance. The temperature change happened over 6 steps, from the near zero of the barn to the 62 degrees of the cellar. And it was so sudden and so total that his body did not know how to respond to it, could not process it as real. He stood on the warm stone floor of the cellar and shook not from cold now, but from the shock of its cessation. The room was everything he had seen in November, but occupied now. The bed was made, but obviously slept in the indentation of her body still in the mattress. The shelf held its jars and tins. On the small spirit stove in the corner, a covered pot sat cooling. And on the flat stone she used as a table a loaf of bread, round and dark crusted steam still rising from it in the lantern light. He looked at the bread. He could not look away from it. He was a man who had spent the past several hours moving through a world that was trying to kill him. And he was looking at bread that someone had baked that morning in a room 60 feet from the killing cold, in a room that smelled of warmth and earth, and the specific domestic certainty of someone who is not afraid. He sat down on the floor, not on the stool, not on the crate, the floor. His legs simply arranged it that way, and he sat on the warm stone floor of the cellar and put his hands flat against it, and felt the heat moving through the stone into his palms. The stored heat of a fire that had burned 2 days ago. Still present, still generous. Still doing its work without being asked to. He said one word. Please. Elsa looked at him for a moment. Then she said, bring them here. He went back into the storm. Margaret had seen him go out with the rope and had understood something addressed Henry in everything available and had put together a bundle of the things she would need and the things the boy would need. And she had them ready when Hatch came through the door. He did not explain. There were no words that would have been more efficient than simply moving, and they moved out the door into the white, following the rope back out, and then Hatch leading them across the unmarked distance to the barn by memory, and by the faith that the fence line would be where it had always been. Henry did not cry. He was 6 years old, and he pressed his face against his mother's coat, and he did not cry. And this cost him something, and Hatch knew it, and he moved faster. They went down the steps, Margaret first. The boy handed down to her, then Hatch pulling the cellar door shut above him. The slab would not go back into place from below. He would deal with that later. Or it did not matter, because the cellar's thermal mass was sufficient to hold its temperature against the barn air, even with the slab displaced. Margaret stood on the warm stone floor with Henry in her arms and said nothing for a long time. She looked at the room, the bed, the shelf, the lantern, the skylight dark with storm above. But present the journal on the shelf, the bread on the flat stone. She looked at Elsa. She looked at the walls, at the inscription. B. Holmeson, 1869. God willing it holds. She sat down on the bed, Henry in her lap, and she held him and rocked him slightly, the way mothers rock children, not because the children need rocking, but because the motion is something to do with the love that has nowhere else to go. Elsa cut the bread into thick slices and handed them around. She brought water from the crock in the corner, cool but not frozen. She set the covered pot on the spirit stove and let the bean soup within it warm slowly. Hatch sat against the wall with his legs extended on the stone floor, both hands pressed flat against it, and did not speak. The storm raged above them. They could hear it. A muffled roar, distant in the way that thunder is distant. When you are inside a solid building, the sound real but contained, not present. It was the sound of a world that had decided to destroy itself and was making considerable progress, but that could not reach into this particular 10 by 12 foot space of ancient stone and stored warmth, where 4 people were eating bread and soup and listening to it fail. Henry fell asleep against his mother. His breathing was easier in the warm air. Margaret covered him with the quilt from Elsa's bed and sat with her hand on his back, feeling him breathe. She looked at Elsa across the small space. "How did you know?" she said. "My grandmother knew," Elsa said. "I only followed her instructions." Margaret nodded the nod of a woman filing this answer in the correct location. Then she looked at her husband. Hatch was looking at the floor. He had the expression of a man doing something very difficult, internally, something that requires the same kind of sustained effort that physical labor requires, but leaves different marks. He was a man who had built his entire identity on knowing, on being the person in any room who understood construction better than anyone else, who had faced the Dakota winters and developed the correct response to them, who had passed that response on to the community as a form of authority that was also He had believed a form of care. He had not been dishonest. He had been wrong, and the difference between those two things was not as comforting as he might have hoped. The storm lasted 3 days. They ate what Elsa had, which was sufficient because she had provisioned for herself through the winter. And what she had provisioned was real food stored at the correct temperature for its preservation, undamaged by the wild swings that destroyed food in surface structures. The potatoes were firm. The preserved fruit was intact. The beans were what beans always were, patient, reliable, the most democratic of foods. On the second day, Hatch took the journal from the shelf and asked if he could read it. Elsa said yes. He read for several hours, slowly going back frequently to the diagrams and calculations, tracing the lines with his fingertip. The way a builder traces a blueprint, reading the construction through the drawing. He read Oma Bretta's account of the Minnesota winter, of the failure and the correction of the second attempt, done correctly. He read it twice. He put the journal back on the shelf with the care of a man returning something that belongs to a museum. He looked at Elsa. "I owe you an accounting," he said. He meant more than an apology, and they both understood that. "Not yet," she said. "Not down here. There's time for that above." On the fourth day, the wind died. It did not taper off. It stopped in the way that extremes sometimes stop, suddenly completely leaving behind a silence so total. It had a texture, a presence of its own. The world above was transformed. They could hear the silence. Elsa went up first, pushing the barn door open against the drift that had formed against it. The light outside was blinding, a brilliant, flat, reflected light from a landscape that was entirely white and entirely reshaped. The drifts had altered the geography. Things that had been visible were buried. Things that had not existed before, long, sculpted waves of compressed snow had been created by the wind and left there as permanent seeming as geological features. She stood in the barn doorway and breathed the clean, cold air, which was still very cold, but was cold in the ordinary way again, without malice, without intention. Hatch came up behind her. He stood in the doorway and looked at the changed world for a long time. Then he looked at his property, just visible in the distance, the outline of the house, smoke no longer coming from the chimney. Margaret came up with Henry, who looked at the white world with the undefended wonder of a 6-year-old confronting something genuinely new. They dug their way out over the following 2 days, the community organizing itself with the particular efficiency that crisis produces, teams of men working with shovels to connect one homestead to the next, to check on those who had not been heard from. The accounting was done in the quiet, careful way that Plains communities count their losses without ceremony, because ceremony takes time. They do not have, but with the full weight of acknowledgement, because these were people they knew. Several families had not survived. They were found the way Hatch had feared Elsa would be found, in their cabins, in their cold, gathered around stoves that had run out of what they needed. The stoves were there. The houses were there. The walls had done their best. It had not been enough. The news that the Hatch family had survived in the Voss cellar spread through the community in the way that remarkable things spread in small, isolated places quickly, completely, with the details gaining precision, rather than losing it as they traveled. Because the people passing the story on knew both the parties and the place, and had the context to understand what they were hearing. Reverend Aldous Marsh came with the first party that reached the Voss property. He was a man who had prayed for Elsa in October with the sincere grief of someone praying for the already lost. He descended the cellar steps slowly, one hand on the stone wall, and he stood on the warm floor and looked at the room, and his face did something complicated that included several emotions arriving at different speeds. He pressed his palm against the stone floor. He held it there for a long time. He looked at the inscription on the wall. He looked at the skylight, which was showing a square of the pale winter sky above, close and real. He looked at Elsa. "Forgive me, child," he said. It was simple. It was everything. "You saw what you knew," she said. "We all do." Marta Jensen came the following day. She looked at the skylight at her husband's window glass, set in the frame at its precise angle, doing what Elsa had told her it would do. And she smiled. It was the smile of a woman who gave something away without knowing what it would become, and has learned what it became. She and Elsa stood in the barn together for a while, without speaking the way women who understand each other sometimes do not need to. The community meeting was held in the schoolhouse 10 days after the storm ended, when the roads were passable, and most of the survivors had had time to begin processing what had happened. Cornelius Hatch stood before the assembled homesteaders hat in hand, in the specific posture of a man who has prepared what he will say and is committed to saying all of it. He did not apologize in the soft, general way of someone performing remorse. He spoke like the builder he was. He explained what his system had done and why it had failed. Not because it was poorly built, but because the design philosophy was wrong. He explained the thermal dynamics the way a conventional structure. Hemorrhages heat the mathematical reality that the more ferocious the cold, the more impossible the equation becomes. He explained what he had felt in the cellar, the stone floor, the stored warmth, the absence of wind. He explained what a cord and a half meant against 7 cords, and what that difference meant for the families who ran out of wood before the storm ended. He said, "We have been fighting the wrong battle. We built our homes in the teeth of the wind when the earth was offering us something else." Mrs. Voss and her grandmother before her, and the woman who built that cellar before both of them, understood what none of us were willing to consider. The cold does not have to be defeated. It only has to be avoided. He reached into his coat and produced the note on the Voss property, the debt document, the instrument of Elsa's potential dispossession. He held it up so the room could see it. Then he folded it twice and tore it. He set the pieces on the table in front of him. The debt is forgiven. The land is Mrs. Voss's clear and free. In the silence that followed, Marta Jensen began to clap. Not enthusiastically, not dramatically. Just her 2 hands steady and certain the way she did everything. After a moment, others joined. Elsa sat in the second row and did not stand and did not speak. She had given Hatch permission to tell the story because the story needed to be told, and he was the right person to tell it. He was the one they had believed, which meant he was the one whose change of mind would move them. She had no desire to perform her own vindication. She had simply done a thing and the thing had worked, and now she was interested in what came next. What came next was work. The men who came to her farm that winter came with questions, not pity. They came with hats in hands and specific technical questions about depths and stone selection, and the angle of the glass, and the dimensions of the stone platform for the rendering pot. They brought paper and pencils and took notes. Some brought their sons, because they understood that what they were learning was not just for themselves, but for whoever came after them on this land. Elsa taught them from the journal, but she did not teach them only from the journal. She taught them from her own experience from the 3 days she had spent relaying a stone floor she had laid incorrectly from the hour she had spent clearing a ventilation flue by feel alone. From the moment she had first felt the cellar temperature hold at 62 degrees while 12 below zero existed 12 feet above her, she taught them the theory, and she taught them the corrections, and she taught them the part that the theory does not fully capture, which is that there is a moment in building any of these systems where you have to trust the process before the process has proved itself, and that trust is a skill that can be learned. In the spring, when the snow retreated and the land began its slow reassertion of color and possibility, the first new construction in the county reflected what had been learned. Not dramatically, the surface structures still stood because people still needed them, but they sat lower and their cellars were deeper, and the south-facing windows were larger and angled more deliberately to the winter sun. Wood piles were smaller and the wood in them was supplementary rather than essential. Hatch oversaw the design of these modifications working from Oma Britta's journal, which Elsa had agreed to let him copy every page, every diagram, every margin note, and from the additional understanding he had developed in 3 days, sitting on a warm stone floor, thinking about everything he had gotten wrong. He did this work with the specific dedication of a man who has been given an opportunity to correct a significant error and understands that the opportunity is not infinite. On an afternoon in early April, when the light had finally achieved the quality of genuine warmth, and the mud of the thaw was everywhere and insistent, Elsa sat at the table in her cabin, habitable again. Now she had spent February recalking and improving it with some of what she had learned, and opened the journal to the last blank page. She held the pen for a moment. She had thought about what she wanted to write. She had thought about the winter and about Cornelius Hatch sitting on the floor with his palms against the stone, and about Marta's window glass, and about Henry asleep under the quilt, and about the inscription on the wall, and about Oma Britta in Minnesota in 1843, tearing up a stone floor with numb hands and beginning again. She wrote, "Britta Holmson built these stairs in 1869. Oma Britta taught me to walk down them. I will leave this journal for whoever comes next, as it was left for me. The instructions are correct. Follow all of them, even the ones on page 47, especially those." She closed the journal. Outside, the Dakota spring was doing what it did, asserting itself over everything the winter had imposed. Water moving again where it had been still ground, softening where it had been hard. The stubborn grass finding its way up through the last patches of snow. The sky was enormous and blue, and for the moment entirely without threat. Elsa set the journal back on the shelf. She put on her coat and walked out into the April morning across the mud and the lingering snow to the barn. She pushed the doors open and stood in the doorway looking at the stone slab in the center of the floor, the hole in the roof above the rendering pot, the skylight set at its precise angle in the south wall. The cellar below was still a few degrees warmer than the surface and would be for another month or so, the thermal mass releasing its last reserves of stored winter heat. She pressed her palm flat against the stone slab. Still warm, still holding. She straightened up. She looked at the inscription above the skylight where she had carved it herself in February, the letters, careful and deliberate, each one cut with patience into the fresh wood of the frame. Evos, 1888. No further words. The date was enough. It said someone was here. Someone built this. Someone trusted the earth, and the earth kept faith. She walked back out into the morning. The land around her was her own, clear and free, as Hatch had said. The fields were her own. The barn was her own. The cellar beneath it, and the warmth it had held, and the lives that warmth had saved were her own. Not to keep. To pass on. The year ahead would bring its work, and the year after that would bring more. There were fields to plant and a cabin to properly finish, and a community of people who were learning slowly, as communities do, with the resistance and the acceptance arriving in no predictable order. That the oldest wisdom is often the most reliable, and that what has been proven against the hardest possible standard is worth more than any theory built in comfortable conditions. She knew all of this. She had known it in some form since she stood in the cellar in October with a pickaxe in her hands and the journal open to the page her grandmother had written. In a different winter, in a different state, in the same specific emergency of a woman who needed to be warm and was willing to do the work to make it possible. The morning was bright. The mud was deep. The grass was coming. Elsa Voss walked toward her fields,